I have heard a great many stories about women in the frontier West who were underestimated. By creditors, by neighbors, by men who should have known better. But I have seldom encountered one that illustrated the particular arithmetic of that underestimation, quite as precisely as the story of Hazel Corrigan and Warren Doss, which began not with a courtship or a quarrel but with a list. Warren Doss arrived at Hazel Corrigan's farm on a Tuesday morning in October of 1886, riding a gray roan and carrying nothing but a surveyor's map folded badly, and a question about the water easement running through her upper field. He had been in Harlan County, Montana Territory, for less than 3 weeks. Long enough to have purchased the old Sutter acreage on the county's eastern edge, and short enough that no one had yet finished, telling him everything he needed to know about the people whose land bordered his. He had heard Hazel Corrigan mentioned twice in those 3 weeks. Once as the widow who ran the Corrigan place alone, and once as the woman who apparently understood water law better than the county commissioner, which Warren found either impressive or suspicious, and he had not yet decided which. He found her at the fence of the upper field, examining a drainage channel with the expression of a woman who had found something genuinely interesting and was deciding what to make of it, when he stated his business, that he needed to understand the water rights attached to her land, before the spring runoff made the question urgent. She looked at him for a long moment and said that she would answer his question gladly, but that there was something he ought to know first, before he decided whether her answer was worth the trouble of listening to. She said, "There are 7 men in this county, Mr. Doss, who have each in turn refused to take my counsel seriously. I have found it saves time to say so plainly before I offer counsel to anyone new. That way, if you are inclined to agree with any of them, you can say so now, and we will both spare ourselves the conversation." Warren considered this. He was a man who had a habit of considering things without saying much during the considering, which some people found off-putting and which Hazel found neither alarming nor particularly encouraging. Simply neutral, which was something. He said, "I would rather hear the 7 names and form my own opinion after." Hazel looked at him the way she had learned to look at men who said unexpected things. Carefully, searching for the place where the unexpectedness would eventually resolve into the familiar shape she had come to expect. She did not find it immediately. She said, "Very well, I will give you all 7. Tell me when you have heard enough." Warren leaned against the fence post with the settled posture of a man who had nowhere else he needed to be that morning, and said only, "Begin wherever you like." To understand why Hazel Corrigan kept such an exact accounting of her 7 dismissals, you have to understand what the 4 years preceding that October morning had cost her, and how much of that cost she had absorbed without assistance. Her husband, Daniel Corrigan, had died of a fever in the spring of 1882, leaving her the farm, the debt attached to it, a mother-in-law who helped where she could, and a county full of neighbors who had assumed, without particular malice, that a woman alone would not be managing the Corrigan acreage for long. Daniel had been well liked. Hazel had been well regarded in the way a capable wife was well regarded, as evidence of her husband's good judgment, rather than as a capable person in her own right. What the county had not adequately accounted for was that Hazel had grown up the only child of a land surveyor named Garrett Pruitt, who had no sons and a considerable amount of practical knowledge about soil drainage, water rights, crop rotation, and the specific way a balance sheet revealed the truth if you read it without looking away. Her father had taught her these things not out of any particular conviction about the education of women, but simply because she was there, and sharp, and he was not a man who wasted an available mind. By the time Daniel died, Hazel understood the Corrigan land better than Daniel had. Not because Daniel was careless, but because she had spent 10 years paying close attention to everything he had paid louder attention to, and had understood several things about the farm's water management and soil composition that Daniel had intended to get around to eventually. She had kept the farm, she had paid down the debt, she had turned a modest profit in each of the 2 seasons before Warren Doss arrived asking about easements, and she had accumulated in the process 7 specific instances of men in Harlan County who had declined to take her knowledge seriously, each for his own stated reason, each leaving her with a cleaner and more detailed picture of exactly what the county considered worth listening to, and what it did not. The first name was Vernon Streck, the county's principal creditor, who had declined her loan application in the winter following Daniel's death. She had presented him with 3 years of the farm's ledgers, a written assessment of its soil quality, and a repayment schedule she had calculated at 2 separate interest rates. He had told her gently that the problem was not the paperwork, which was, he acknowledged, thorough, but the simple practical reality that a farm without a man at its head was a farm likely to fail, and that he could not in good conscience lend against a likely failure. Warren said, "I looked into local credit history before I bought the Sutter place. Vernon Streck extended a cattle loan to a rancher from the south end of the county 2 years after he refused yours, and that loan defaulted inside 1 season. I suspect the real difficulty was not your security, Mrs. Corrigan. It was the discomfort of a man who had just been handed paperwork, considerably more careful than what he typically received from the borrowers he routinely approved, and who found that discomfort easier to resolve by declining than by examining. The second name was Joel Hamner, the land agent who had refused to sell her the Prentice parcel, 12 acres of bottomland adjoining her upper field, on the grounds that a widow managing existing acreage had no practical business taking on additional land she would likely struggle to work. He had sold the Prentice parcel 6 weeks after turning her away, to a man from Helena who had let it lie fallow for 3 consecutive seasons before selling it at a loss to a third party. Warren said, I looked at that parcel before I bought the Sutter place. The soil there requires a specific drainage treatment to produce anything worth harvesting, and the treatment is not obvious unless you know what you are looking for. I expect you identified it quickly. Hazel said, the second morning I walked it. Warren said, and Hamner sold it to a man who evidently did not. I do not think his objection was your ability to work the land, Mrs. Corrigan. I think it was the possibility that you would succeed where he had assumed you would fail, and he preferred to avoid witnessing the demonstration. The third name was Clifton Mercer, a neighboring farmer of considerable local standing, who had declared at the autumn Grange meeting of 1883, in the hearing of a large portion of the county's farming community, that Hazel Corrigan was managing her acreage above her station, and that the county would be better served if she sold to someone properly equipped to work it. He had said it with the easy authority of a man accustomed to his opinions being received as settled facts, and it had entered the general record of town understanding in exactly that way. Warren was quiet after this one for a moment longer than he had been after the previous 2. He said, Clifton Mercer's south field has underproduced every season I have been able to find record of, because he refuses to rotate his grain. I was told this within my first week here, and told also that he has received the same advice from at least 3 separate sources over the past several years, and declined to act on any of them. I do not think Mercer's concern at the Grange meeting was your station, Mrs. Corrigan. I think his farm had been quietly performing below yours for long enough that a public statement about your unsuitability was considerably more comfortable than a private examination of his own land management. Hazel had not, in 4 years of carrying these 7 names, heard them examined in this particular way. Each one turned over in this careful light to reveal not her deficiency, but the specific reasoning of the man doing the dismissing. Reasoning that had considerably less to do with her than she had always been expected to assume. She found that something in her chest that had been holding itself tightly for a long time was beginning, very gradually, to release its grip. She continued. The 4th and 5th names she offered together, since their dismissals had occurred within the same season, and had carried nearly identical justifications. Dwight Bauer and Samuel Fitch were the 2 largest grain buyers operating in Harlan County, and both had declined to purchase her 1884 wheat crop, citing in almost the same words an unwillingness to rely on a woman's own grading assessment of her grain quality. They had offered to buy the wheat at a reduced rate, pending an independent assessment by a man they trusted. The grade Hazel had assigned her crop proved, when a buyer from the neighboring county assessed it independently, to be exactly correct. Warren said, I have bought grain in 3 territories, Mrs. Corrigan, and I can tell you that an accurate eye for wheat grading is not a common skill. What Bauer and Fitch told you was not that they doubted your grading. It was that they doubted the possibility of your grading, before they had seen it, which is a different thing entirely, and a less honest one. Both of them acted on the same assumption, and were proved wrong by the same evidence, and I think neither of them has spent much time since then, examining what that says about the assumption, rather than about you. The 6th name was the one Hazel gave most slowly, not from reluctance, but from the particular care she had learned to apply to the telling of it, because it was the one that had required the most from her, and left the deepest scar on the record. The 6th name was Nathaniel Corrigan, her late husband's elder brother, who had arrived at the farm 14 months after Daniel's death with a lawyer, and a claim that the Corrigan land ought properly to pass through the male line of the family, and that Hazel's position as manager was a temporary arrangement that Daniel could not have intended to be permanent. The claim had no legal foundation. Daniel's will had been unambiguous, but Nathaniel had pursued it through 2 rounds of county proceedings before withdrawing, and had said publicly during those proceedings that a woman who could not produce a male heir to carry on the Corrigan name had no genuine claim to carry on the Corrigan land. Warren's expression changed when he heard this name, in a way that told Hazel he was a man who did not often let his face say things ahead of his words, and that what he was feeling at that moment was not a small thing. He said after a considerable pause, I will not call that a dismissal, Mrs. Corrigan. I will call it what it actually was. An attempt to take what belonged to you by law, by labor, and by right, dressed in the language of family tradition, because tradition was the only argument available to a man who did not have a legal one. I have considerably less measured charity for that name than for any of the previous 5. Hazel said. It was the most expensive to fight. Not because I was uncertain of the legal outcome, but because I fought it while still running the farm, still managing the debt, and still being observed by every neighbor in the county to see whether the pressure would finally prove them all correct about me. Warren said nothing for a moment and then said only, "It did not prove them correct." Hazel said no, it did not. The 7th and final name was the one she had taken the longest to arrive at a full understanding of, and the one she still found required a certain deliberate steadiness to recount, without her voice doing something she did not intend. The 7th name was Jerome Haas, a traveling agricultural extension agent, who had spent nearly 2 years visiting Harlan County on a quarterly circuit, and who had during those 2 years, engaged Hazel in an extended series of conversations about her methods for improving the drainage and soil composition of her upper field. Conversations he had initiated, she said, always with the language of professional exchange, of mutual inquiry, of 2 people sharing observations for the common benefit of the county's farming community. In the spring of 1885, Jerome Haas had published a pamphlet through the Territorial Agricultural Office, distributed across 4 counties, titled Soil Improvement Methods for Montana Drainage Fields. The methods described in that pamphlet, specific technical, and developed through Hazel's own observation and systematic trial on the Corrigan land over the previous decade, were presented without attribution as the author's own findings. Jerome Haas had sat in Hazel's kitchen 17 times. He had drunk her coffee and written her observations into his notebook, with a pencil she could still picture exactly. And he had never in 2 years of visits or in the document that followed, written her name. Warren did not say anything for a long time after this final name. When he spoke, his voice had the particular level quality that voices take on when the feeling beneath them is not a small or simple one. He said, "Every name before that one was a man who underestimated you. That last name is a man who understood you entirely and chose to profit from what he understood without the basic honesty to say so. I find I am more disturbed by Jerome Haas than by anything else you have told me this morning, Mrs. Corrigan, and I was not indifferent to the previous 6. Hazel said quietly, "It was the one that taught me the most about how a dismissal does not always present itself as one. The first 6 told me plainly they did not believe I was capable. Jerome Haas spent 2 years behaving as though he believed I was. That is what made what he did with that belief considerably worse than a plain refusal would have been." They stood at the fence of the upper field, without speaking, the October wind moving through the dry grass on the slope below them. Then Warren said, "I have now heard all 7. Would you like to hear what I think they add up to?" Hazel said, "I find that I would." He said it carefully, each name in order, the way a man reads back a column of figures to confirm the arithmetic before he trusts it. Streck feared your paperwork was more thorough than his judgment. Hamner feared you would succeed, where he had publicly assumed you would fail, and preferred to prevent the evidence. Mercer feared that his own land's performance compared unfavorably to yours, and chose a public statement about your limitations over a private examination of his own. Bauer and Fitch feared a skill they had not expected to find in the person standing in front of them, and dressed that failure of expectation as a question about your credibility. Nathaniel Corrigan feared losing access to land he had no legal right to, and used the language of family because it was the only cover available. And Jerome Haas did not fear your ability at all. He simply decided it was more convenient for him if no one else knew it was yours. He let that settle. 7 names, Mrs. Corrigan. Not one of them says anything true about you. Every single one says something about what the man doing the refusing was trying to avoid knowing about himself." Hazel stood at her fence and listened to her own accumulated record, recited back to her in this precise and redirected order, and could not find a single point of factual disagreement anywhere in his accounting. She said, "You came about a water easement, Mr. Doss." He said, "I did." She said, "Come inside, I have the original survey documents and the water rights filing from 1871. The easement question is straightforward once you understand how the drainage channel was registered, but easy to misread if you are working from the county map alone." He followed her inside. What happened next is the part of this story that Harlan County came to understand in pieces rather than all at once, which is the way most things of substance are understood in small communities, where each piece of information travels its own route before the full picture assembles. Warren Doss returned to the Corrigan farm the following Thursday, with a question about his lower field's soil composition. He returned the week after that with a different question, and the week after that with another, and by December he had stopped pretending entirely, that his questions were the primary reason he was riding the gray roan out along the eastern road on a regular basis. He proposed, in January of 1887, a formal partnership arrangement on the water rights management for both properties. He said, without apparent discomfort, that she was considerably more competent to manage the matter than he was, and that pretending otherwise would cost them both. Hazel said she would consider it. She said also that she intended to examine any new arrangement with the same attention she applied to everything else, and that if he proved to be the 8th name on her list, she would add him to it with the same care she had extended to the previous 7. Warren said that seemed entirely reasonable, and that he would expect nothing less from a woman who kept such careful records. They were married in the spring of 1888. She continued to manage the Corrigan land. She continued to apply her drainage and soil methods to both properties, which by 1890 were producing consistently better yields than any comparable acreage in the county. She eventually contributed a formal written account of her methods to a published agricultural survey of Montana farming practices. This time under her own name, with a technical completeness that made it considerably more useful than the pamphlet it quietly superseded. The Territorial Agricultural Office noted, in their correspondence acknowledging her submission, that the methods described showed a depth of field observation that was, in their words, uncommon. Vernon Streck retired from crediting within 3 years, his practice having declined through a series of bad loans extended to borrowers whose paperwork had been considerably less careful than Hazel's. His successor made no distinctions that Streck had made. Clifton Mercer's Southfield continued to underperform until his son took over management, and finally implemented the crop rotation that 4 separate advisors had recommended over the course of a decade. By that point the Corrigan Doss land had produced consistent yields for 8 consecutive seasons, a fact that required no commentary to make its point. Jerome Haas returned to Harlan County in 1889 on his extension circuit and encountered, in the new Territorial Agricultural Survey, a detailed and properly attributed account of the drainage methods he had published in 1885 under his own name. The technical specificity of the survey made it apparent to any reader familiar with both documents that the 1885 pamphlet had not originated with its stated author. Jerome Haas did not return to Harlan County after that visit. Nathaniel Corrigan was the only name on Hazel's list who offered a direct apology. He arrived at the farm nearly 6 years after his legal proceedings had failed, older and, by his own account, sufficiently brought low by difficulties of his own, that he had finally arrived at the capacity to say plainly what he should have said years earlier. Hazel accepted the apology without cruelty and without warmth. She told Warren afterward that she had not needed Nathaniel's acknowledgement to know she had been right, but that she was glad he had found his way to it, since a man incapable of acknowledging error tended to repeat the same error until the cost became unavoidable. Warren said that seemed like an accurate description of most of the men on her list. Hazel said she thought it was an accurate description of most of the men who had never appeared on her list either, which was the larger group and, in some ways, the more instructive one. They had been married 12 years when I first heard this story, passed to me through the kind of accumulated county memory that moves across fence lines, and through Grange meetings until the original facts have worn smooth, and the essential truth is all that remains. What remained by the time it reached me was this: a woman who had kept an exact and useful record of what the world had refused to see in her, and a man who had understood that the record was not a catalogue of her failures. It was a map, a precise, well-maintained map of exactly the kind of mind and capability he had spent a long time hoping without much confidence to find. A dismissal, carefully examined, tells you very little about the person being dismissed. It tells you a great deal about the person doing the dismissing, what they cannot afford to acknowledge, what they prefer not to see directly, what they are quietly trying to protect themselves from knowing. Most people absorb dismissals as information about themselves. Hazel Corrigan absorbed them as information about the county she lived in, which gave her something considerably more valuable: an accurate picture of where she stood, and a clear-eyed understanding of exactly how far she had already traveled. Tell me in the comments, of the 7 men on Hazel's list, which one do you think revealed the most about his own limits rather than hers? And if you want another story about a person the whole county had quietly decided to write off, the next one is waiting for you right here.